An elderly mother arrived to visit her wealthy son, but when she opened the door, she discovered something that left her frozen. No. The dawn was just beginning to tint the fields with light when Eleanor woke up, as she had done all her life. Her small home in the countryside, with furniture worn by time, was submerged in the same silence as always. A silence that in recent years had become heavier. The morning chills seeped through the walls, but that didn't matter to Eleanor. She had something more urgent that unsettled her. Her son, Andrew. She had grown accustomed to long nights awake, thinking of him. Time seemed to have stood still since the last time she received a call or a letter from him. 2 years had passed since his last visit, and although at first she had justified his absence with the relentless pace of life in the city, doubts began to gnaw at her. The neighbors constantly asked her, "And your son, Mrs. Eleanor, when is he coming to visit you?" Eleanor always smiled and replied that Andrew was very busy, but inside the anguish grew like a shadow. As she dressed in her best clothes, a brown wool skirt and a blouse she had saved for special occasions, Eleanor made a decision she had been avoiding. She couldn't wait any longer. The nights were too long and the silence too painful. If Andrew wouldn't come to her, she would go find him. She had raised her son with her own hands, working from sunrise to sunset in the fields after the death of her husband. He was everything to her. She couldn't leave things as they were without at least knowing the truth. Was he okay? Had he found something that pulled him away from his mother? Or was there something darker behind his disappearance? With a small suitcase in hand, Eleanor left her house, closing the door with a lump in her throat. The journey to the city wasn't long in terms of distance, but the emotional weight made it seem endless. She boarded the old bus that would take her to her destination, sitting in a corner while she watched the countryside landscapes fade away through the window. She remembered the times she had bid farewell to Andrew when he left for the city, full of dreams and promises. He had promised to return. He had promised that his success would also be hers. But now, after so many years of silence, those memories filled her with overwhelming sadness. As the hours passed, the landscape changed. The vast plains of the countryside transformed into gray, tall buildings that seemed to defy the sky. The city was noisy, bustling, and completely foreign to Eleanor. The car lights, the incessant noise of traffic, the hurried people, all of it made her feel small, as if she were in a place where she didn't belong. But there was no turning back. Andrew was here, and she had to find him. Upon arriving at the bus station, Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the number of people coming and going without even noticing her. With difficulty, she found the crumpled piece of paper with the address of Andrew's mansion. She had kept it in her purse since the last time he had written to her. The address was in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, a place she had never imagined visiting. She took a taxi, and as the car drove through the luxurious streets, Eleanor gazed in amazement at the enormous buildings and mansions passing by her window. She had never seen houses so big, so perfect. They were cold, spotless, and didn't seem to have life. She recalled Andrew's promise. "One day I'll bring you to live with me, Mom, in the city where everything is easier, more comfortable." But Eleanor had never wanted to leave her life in the countryside. All she ever wanted was for her son to be happy, even if it meant being far from her. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of an imposing mansion. The wrought iron gates and the perfectly manicured garden intimidated her. With trembling hands, she paid the taxi driver and got out of the car, standing in front of the door. She felt the weight of the luxury surrounding her, as if that place were judging her. She took a deep breath and gathered her courage to ring the bell. Several minutes passed that seemed like an eternity to Eleanor. Finally, the door opened slowly, revealing a young woman elegantly dressed. Her beauty was cold, and when her eyes met Eleanor's, they filled with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "Yes," the woman asked, not even trying to hide her scorn. "I'm Eleanor, Andrew's mother," she replied with a trembling voice. The woman's face showed no emotion, not a smile, not a welcoming gesture. "Andrew isn't home," she said curtly. "He's very busy with his business." The disappointment and unease Eleanor felt intensified, but she didn't let herself be intimidated. She had come from far away. She had traveled with a broken heart to see her son, and she wouldn't leave so easily. "I've come from the countryside to see him. "I can wait until he returns," she said with a calmness that didn't reflect the emotional chaos she felt. Victoria, as the woman introduced herself, looked at her with a mixture of irritation and disdain. After a few seconds of discomfort, she finally agreed to let her in, leading her to a small room near the entrance. The contrast between the mansion's opulence and Eleanor's humility was evident, but she wasn't swayed by it. She just wanted to know where her son was and why he hadn't told her anything about his new life, especially about his marriage. The wait would be long, but at that moment, Eleanor was willing to do anything to reunite with Andrew. The silence in the house, however, was unsettling, and as Eleanor settled on a sofa that didn't seem to have ever been used, a dark feeling began to grow in her chest. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. Eleanor couldn't stop looking around as she settled into the enormous, luxurious living room of the mansion. The contrast between the antique furniture of her countryside home and the cold opulence that surrounded her at that moment was overwhelming. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, and velvet curtains fell heavily to the floor, as if hiding secrets behind them. However, despite the luxury, something about that place felt empty to her, as if the house itself lacked life. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably on the leather sofa that creaked under her weight. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there, but her love for Andrew kept her firm. She had traveled so far to see him, and she wouldn't leave without answers. She looked around, searching for signs of her son, a photo, some memento that would confirm this was his home, but she found nothing. Not a single photograph of Andrew, no trace of his presence. It was as if the mansion didn't reflect anything of him. Minutes passed before Victoria, Andrew's wife, returned to the living room. Her expression remained cold, almost detached, and she carried a cup of tea that she placed in front of Eleanor on a low table. "Here, to warm you up," she said in an indifferent tone. "Thank you, dear," Eleanor replied softly, hoping to break the barrier between them. "When do you think Andrew will return? I'm eager to see him." Victoria sat in a nearby chair, crossing her legs with an elegance that seemed calculated. Her eyes scanned Eleanor's small, tired body, evaluating every aspect of her humble appearance. "Andrew is very busy lately," Victoria replied. "Business consumes all his time. Sometimes he doesn't even come home at night. He's always traveling, closing important deals. He's a very sought-after man." Eleanor nodded slowly, but something in Victoria's words didn't convince her. This wasn't the Andrew she knew. Her son had always been dedicated but also caring. He would never have left his mother so long without communicating, much less with the indifference that Victoria now projected. Every word she said seemed to have a layer of coldness and distance, as if there was something she didn't want to reveal. "When do you think I might see him?" Eleanor insisted, her voice firmer than before. "I don't know," Victoria replied, standing up again. "He may take days, perhaps weeks. I'm not sure of his schedule, but if you wish, you can stay here until he returns." Victoria didn't wait for a response before turning to leave, leaving Eleanor alone once more in that enormous, empty living room. Eleanor watched as Victoria's figure disappeared behind a door and was left with the echo of her own thoughts. Time passed slowly in the mansion. The rays of light entering through the windows began to fade as the sun set, tinting everything in shades of orange and gold. The seconds felt eternal as Eleanor waited for some sign, some news of her son. The tea that Victoria had brought her had grown cold, but she didn't touch it. Her stomach was too unsettled to drink or eat anything. Hours later, Eleanor began to feel even more uncomfortable. The silence in the mansion was unsettling, almost oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and every small sound, from the creaking of the wood to the distant murmurs of the staff, amplified in her mind. She knew something wasn't right. Her maternal instinct screamed that there was something hidden behind Victoria's coldness, something she wasn't willing to tell her. The house staff passed by occasionally, avoiding looking directly at her. They were like shadows moving quickly from one room to another, as if they wanted to remain invisible. This only increased the unease in Eleanor's heart. No one gave her a smile, not even a look of understanding. She felt like a stranger in her own son's life. Finally, when darkness completely enveloped the house, Victoria returned to the living room. This time, she didn't offer any explanation or kind words. She simply stood at the entrance, looking at Eleanor. "It's late, Mrs. Eleanor," she said without emotion. "I'll ask Edward, our butler, to take you to a room so you can rest. It's possible that Andrew may take several days to return." Eleanor stood up, nodding slowly, although her heart was full of uncertainty. She wanted to say something, to ask more, but she knew that Victoria wouldn't give her any answers. Her son's wife had an impenetrable barrier around her, and there was no way to break through it at the moment. The butler, Edward, appeared at the door. He was an older man with a face marked by experience and a cautious expression. He indicated for Eleanor to follow him down the dark corridors of the mansion in silence. As they walked, Eleanor noticed that Edward avoided making eye contact with her, but there was something in his demeanor that made her think he knew more than he let on. They arrived at a small room far from the center of the house. It was just a guest room, but for Eleanor, it was more than enough. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the echo of Edward's footsteps fading down the hall. Before he could close the door, Eleanor stopped him with a question that had been on her mind since she arrived. "Excuse me, Edward, right?" she said softly. "Do you know when my son will return?" Edward hesitated, as if unsure whether he should answer or not. Finally, he nodded slightly without looking at her. "Your son Andrew is complicated, Mrs. Eleanor," he said, avoiding her gaze. "He's busy." Eleanor realized that Edward knew something important, but for some reason he couldn't say it at that moment. Nevertheless, her intuition told her that he was the key to discovering what was really happening in that house. "If it's not your place, then whose is it?" Eleanor replied, trying to stay calm. "My son is all I have, and something tells me you're not telling me the whole truth." Edward looked away, clearly affected by the situation, but before he could say anything else, a sound in the hallway alerted him. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her cold presence filling the room. "Is everything all right here?" she asked with a tense smile, looking at Eleanor and then at Edward, who immediately stepped back, resuming his work without saying another word. Eleanor felt the weight of Victoria's gaze on her, but said nothing. She knew that, for the moment, she had to be cautious. Pressing her lips together, she made a small bow with her head and returned to the main living room. Later, as evening fell, Eleanor decided to approach Edward again, knowing he was her only ally, albeit a silent one. She found him in the kitchen, organizing some cutlery, and this time made sure no one else was around. "Edward, I know you know something. I beg you, tell me the truth," Eleanor implored in a low voice, her eyes full of pleading. The butler raised his gaze, avoiding eye contact, but this time he couldn't help but respond. "Mrs. Eleanor," he whispered gravely, "things in this house are not what they seem. Your son Andrew is not traveling. He's here, in the house." Eleanor felt a blow to her chest. Andrew was in the house the whole time. Why had Victoria lied? Before she could ask more, Edward continued, lowering his voice even further. "Andrew suffered an accident months ago, a very serious accident. Since then, Victoria hasn't let anyone see him. She keeps him hidden." Eleanor felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Why are they hiding him?" she asked, her voice choked with anguish. "I don't know for sure," Edward replied, looking down. "But many of us believe it wasn't a simple accident. Victoria has changed many things since Andrew fell ill. She's taken full control of the businesses and barely allows anyone to visit him. Even the nurse who cares for him is under her strict control. The entire house has become a prison for Andrew." Eleanor felt a whirlwind of emotions: pain, anger, fear. Andrew, her dear son, was being kept prisoner in his own home under his wife's control, and no one was doing anything to help him. "I have to see him," Eleanor said, clenching her fists. "I have to see my son." Edward looked at her with sadness. "It's not that simple. Victoria has eyes everywhere. She doesn't allow anyone near Andrew without her permission. But there's someone who might be able to help you." Eleanor looked up hopeful. "The nurse who cares for Andrew. Her name is Emma. She's the only one who's seen him since he fell ill. If you can talk to her, maybe you can find out more." Eleanor nodded, feeling that a spark of hope ignited in her soul. Now she had a name, a possible ally. But she also knew that any false move could endanger not only her son's health, but also Emma's and her own life. Edward gently took her arm and guided her to the back of the house, where there was a small garden hidden by the mansion's high walls. "You can't go directly," he warned. "You must wait for the right moment. Victoria leaves the house at certain times to attend to business. When she's absent, I'll find a way for you to talk to Emma. But please, Mrs. Eleanor, be careful. We're not safe here." Eleanor nodded with determination. The cool night air of the garden hit her face, giving her a moment of clarity. She knew that the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but she also understood that facing Victoria would be a challenge full of danger. Back in her room, Eleanor collapsed onto the bed, her mind in constant turmoil. Andrew was there somewhere in the mansion, and she wouldn't stop until she freed him. But now she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Emma and Edward were the keys to discovering the truth and rescuing her son from the clutches of that house which, despite its luxurious exterior, hid dark secrets within. The night became even longer, but this time, Eleanor didn't feel the same emptiness. She knew what she had to do, and nothing and no one could stop her. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon when Eleanor woke up, her thoughts still clouded by what she'd discovered the night before. She knew the situation in the mansion was much darker than Victoria had let on, and that her son was trapped in the middle of a plot she didn't fully understand yet. But the cold, calculating face of Victoria and the fearful tone of Edward made it clear that nothing happening there was accidental. She was waiting for the right moment, just as Edward had promised. Victoria had left the mansion early to attend some business matters. Eleanor felt this was the moment she'd been waiting for. Her heart beat rapidly as she walked down the halls toward the area where Edward had told her she would find Emma, the young nurse caring for Andrew. Finally, she reached a discreet door, almost hidden at the end of a long corridor. She took a deep breath before gently knocking, her hand trembling from the accumulated tension. After a few seconds that seemed eternal, the door opened, revealing a young woman with a tired but kind face. "You're Andrew's mother?" Emma asked in a whisper, as if she already knew who she was, even though they'd never met. Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening with contained emotion. "I need to know the truth about my son," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please tell me what's happening. What has happened to him?" Emma looked nervously around, ensuring no one was listening. Then, with a quick gesture, she motioned for Eleanor to enter. Once inside, Emma carefully closed the door and turned to her, her eyes reflecting concern. "Mrs. Eleanor, there are many things I shouldn't tell you, but you have the right to know," Emma began in an almost inaudible tone. "Your son is gravely ill, and not just from the accident Victoria mentions. I can't prove it, but I suspect Andrew has been slowly poisoned." Eleanor's world stopped at that instant. Emma's words fell like a heavy blow on her chest. "Poisoned?" Eleanor whispered, unable to comprehend. "How is that possible? Who could do such a thing?" Emma took a deep breath before continuing. "Victoria. She controls everything that happens in this house. Since Andrew's accident, no one else has had direct access to his care except me and a few people she trusts. The symptoms he presents aren't consistent with a fall. Weakness, vomiting, loss of mobility, all point to him consuming something that has weakened him slowly. I don't have concrete proof, but every time he shows signs of improvement, he suddenly worsens after one of Victoria's visits." Eleanor felt a cold rage take over her. How could Victoria do something so monstrous? Her son, her dear Andrew, was being destroyed from within by the person he trusted most. "It can't be," she said, struggling to contain her tears. "Why would she do that? What would she gain by harming him?" Emma looked at her sadly. Control. Since Andrew fell ill, Victoria has taken control of all the businesses. She's made suspicious financial moves, and her brother Philip is also involved. Everything points to them slowly draining Andrew's accounts, seizing his assets. If Andrew dies, Victoria would inherit everything. Emma's words hit Eleanor hard. Everything began to make sense. Victoria's coldness, the silence in the house, the staff's evasive glances. It was a plot, a meticulously calculated plan to take away not only Andrew's life, but everything he'd built with so much effort. And meanwhile, her son lay in bed, slowly wasting away. "We have to do something. We have to get him out of here," Eleanor said, her voice filled with desperation. Emma nodded. "I know, but it won't be easy. Victoria has everything under control. Every medication Andrew receives passes through her hands first, and she has the doctors under her command. I've tried changing the treatment, but every time I attempt something different, Victoria finds out. I don't know how much longer I can keep helping him without her noticing." Eleanor felt a knot in her throat. The fear for her son's life was greater than ever, but she knew they couldn't stand by idly. They had to come up with a plan and do it quickly. But they needed evidence, something they could take to the authorities to expose what Victoria was doing. Without proof, everything would be in vain. "Is there a way to get evidence of what they're doing to him?" Eleanor asked, her gaze fixed on Emma. The young nurse nodded, though cautiously. "I've been collecting samples of the medications Victoria gives Andrew. I think I can get a trusted doctor to analyze them, but I'll need time, and it will be risky. If Victoria discovers what we're doing, she could make things worse for Andrew." Eleanor knew time wasn't on their side, but she also understood that without evidence, they'd have no chance. Victoria and Philip were dangerous, and any mistake could endanger not only Andrew's life, but also Emma's and her own. "You have to do it, Emma. It's our only option," Eleanor said, taking the young woman's hands with desperate urgency. "Please, we have to save my son." Emma nodded, determination in her eyes. "I will, but you also have to take care of yourself. Victoria isn't stupid. If she suspects we're up to something, she wouldn't hesitate to act. What we're doing here is extremely dangerous." Eleanor knew that danger loomed over her like a constant shadow, but the love she felt for her son was stronger than any fear. No matter what she had to do, no matter the risk, she wouldn't rest until Andrew was out of danger. As Emma began collecting samples and preparing her plan to analyze them, Eleanor was left alone in the small room. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, she felt fear of what Victoria was capable of doing. But on the other, a growing fury and determination kept her standing. She knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared to face it. As she left the room, Edward appeared in the hallway, his eyes, though tired, showing some relief. "You found out?" he asked in a low voice. Eleanor nodded. "Andrew is being poisoned. Victoria is slowly killing him." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, as if what he just heard confirmed all his suspicions, and then he looked at Eleanor with determination. "I'll help you in any way necessary. We can't let Victoria get away with this." Eleanor nodded. She knew now more than ever she needed allies, and Edward and Emma would be her pillars in this fight. Time was running against them, but now they had a plan, and above all, hope. As the sun began to set, painting the skies a deep red, Eleanor felt that the battle for her son's life had just begun, and she was ready to face Victoria, no matter what it meant. The days passed slowly in the mansion, each one charged with a silent tension. Eleanor felt the weight of uncertainty crushing her more and more as she awaited the moment when Emma could obtain the proof of Andrew's poisoning. She couldn't afford a single mistake or act hastily. The threat posed by Victoria and Philip was greater than she had imagined. During the day, Eleanor spent most of her time walking through the mansion's corridors, attentively observing the staff's and Victoria's movements. However, Victoria seemed busier than ever, constantly on the phone and leaving the house to attend business matters. Although she maintained a facade of control and elegance, Eleanor perceived the coldness and disdain every time Victoria crossed a room without deigning to look at her. Meanwhile, Edward continued to be her only ally among the mansion's staff. The butler kept her informed about Victoria's and Philip's movements, while Emma did everything possible to keep Andrew stable and collect samples of the adulterated medications. Eleanor knew that the evidence wouldn't be enough to save her son. They also needed to unearth Victoria's past, something that could completely unmask her. One afternoon, while the gray sky threatened rain, Eleanor decided to investigate on her own. She knew that somewhere in that mansion, there had to be more clues about who Victoria really was and what dark plans she was hiding. Edward had warned her about Victoria's and Philip's studies, located in one of the most remote areas of the house. They were two rooms that were always locked, but the butler, in an act of loyalty and desperation, had provided her with a copy of the keys. With her heart beating rapidly, Eleanor approached the door of Victoria's study. The mansion was unusually quiet, and she knew that Victoria and Philip had left to attend an important meeting in the city. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The key turned in the lock with a slight click, and Eleanor gently pushed the door open. The study was a perfect reflection of Victoria's personality, impeccably cold, without a hint of human warmth. Dark mahogany furniture and expensive paintings on the walls spoke of power and control. Eleanor walked toward the desk where carefully stacked documents lay. She knew she had to act quickly, but also cautiously. She reviewed the papers with trembling hands, searching for something that could give her a clue about Victoria's dark secrets. Business contracts, financial agreements, everything seemed in order. But then, at the bottom of a drawer, she found something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a personal file with Victoria's name stamped in golden letters. She opened it with nervous hands. The contents of the file were a series of letters and documents that revealed a past Victoria had carefully hidden. The letters were correspondence from her two previous marriages, and as Eleanor read, a clear image began to form in her mind. Victoria had been the widow of two wealthy men before marrying Andrew. Both marriages had ended in tragedy. The two men had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after signing documents naming her the heir to their fortunes. One of the oldest letters, written by the brother of one of the deceased, recounted how he had tried to investigate his brother's death, but all his attempts had been thwarted. Victoria had taken it upon herself to silence the media and anyone who tried to question the official version of the accident. Eleanor felt a sense of disgust and horror overcome her as she realized that Victoria had been repeating this cycle, marrying wealthy men, manipulating them, and disposing of them to keep their fortunes. Andrew, her dear son, was the next victim in that long list of betrayals and deaths. Eleanor clenched her fists as rage and pain fought to overwhelm her, but she knew she couldn't give in to those emotions. She had to stay strong, focused. This information was crucial, but it might not be enough to condemn Victoria without the poisoning evidence. However, with this file, at least she could expose her true character to the authorities. She quickly stored the file in her purse and left the study, knowing there was still Philip's study to check, convinced she'd find more evidence of the financial conspiracy the siblings had been carrying out, while Andrew lay defenseless in his bed. With the same caution, she headed to Philip's study, whose door she also opened with the key Edward had provided. The interior was much more austere than Victoria's, with piles of papers and legal books stacked everywhere. Unlike Victoria's meticulous order, Philip seemed to have controlled chaos around him. Eleanor began reviewing the folders and documents on the desk, looking for anything that could incriminate Philip and his sister. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Contracts signed by Andrew, where he ceded control of his businesses to Victoria. The signatures were recent, but Eleanor knew Andrew had been too ill to even hold a pen in recent weeks. That could only mean one thing: the signatures had been forged. Additionally, she found several records of money transfers to unknown accounts, all linked to Victoria and Philip. The money Andrew had worked so hard to earn was disappearing, being drained in a carefully calculated plan to impoverish him and leave Victoria as the sole heir of whatever was left. The proof was there, right in front of her. Victoria and Philip had been manipulating Andrew's businesses since he fell ill. They didn't just want his life, they also wanted to destroy his legacy, his effort, everything he had built. Eleanor took some quick photographs of the documents with her phone, knowing she had to move fast before someone discovered her. She stored the evidence in her purse and left the study, her heart pounding. She had everything she needed: Victoria's dark past, the forged contracts, and the financial records proving the betrayal. All that was missing were the proofs of the poisoning. She returned to her room, feeling she had finally taken a crucial step towards saving her son. But the weight of what she had discovered also crushed her. How could someone be so cruel? How could the woman who had promised to love and care for Andrew be behind such monstrosity? The next day, Eleanor met with Emma in secret. The nurse handed her the medication samples she had collected in recent days. She stored them carefully, knowing that a trusted doctor would handle the analysis. If their suspicions were confirmed and the medications were adulterated, they would have the definitive proof to take to the authorities. How long do you think it will take to get the results? Eleanor asked anxiously. Emma sighed, clearly exhausted by the tension of recent days. I hope in a couple of days, but we must be careful. Victoria is starting to suspect. If she notices we're up to something, she could make things worse for Andrew. Eleanor nodded, feeling time was their biggest enemy. Every day that passed, Andrew's life hung by a thread, but she also knew they couldn't rush. The only way to defeat Victoria was to be as meticulous as she had been in her plan to destroy Andrew. Emma promised she would continue keeping Andrew as stable as possible, though it was becoming increasingly difficult. The situation was becoming more desperate as the days passed, but both women knew they couldn't give up. Eleanor returned to her room that night, overwhelmed by the weight of the evidence she had collected and the fear that Victoria would discover what they were up to. She knew a confrontation was inevitable, and when that moment came, she would need all the courage and strength she had left to face a woman as dangerous and calculating as Victoria. She looked out the window where the city lights twinkled in the distance. She wondered how many other lives Victoria had destroyed with her unbridled ambition. But one thing was clear to Eleanor: her son would not be the next victim. With this renewed determination, Eleanor mentally prepared for the next steps. The days passed slowly in the mansion, and each hour that went by felt like time was against her. Eleanor knew the situation was becoming more critical with each day. Andrew remained under Victoria's and Philip's control. However, now she had an advantage. The evidence was on its way, and her son's poisoning was about to be exposed. But there was something else that deeply worried her. Even if they obtained the evidence, Andrew was still a prisoner in his own home. Victoria had barely left the mansion in recent days, complicating any attempt to get close to Andrew. Her movements were cold and calculated, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel that Victoria was beginning to suspect something. Nevertheless, fate soon gave her the opportunity she'd been waiting for. One morning, Edward informed her that Victoria and Philip had an important meeting outside the city and would be away for most of the day. This was the moment Eleanor, Emma, and Edward had been waiting for. The escape plan had to be executed now. Any delay could be fatal. They knew they couldn't simply take Andrew out of the mansion without someone stopping them. So they had devised a meticulous plan. It was barely dawn when Victoria and Philip left the house. The ever-efficient and discreet butler confirmed that the entrance guards and security cameras had been temporarily deactivated, thanks to a small glitch he had orchestrated himself. Time was on their side, but they also knew any mistake could cost them dearly. Emma was in Andrew's room, preparing him for the move. Andrew, though weak and barely conscious, seemed to perceive that something important was about to happen. His eyes, dulled by illness, moved slowly as he tried to understand what was happening around him. Eleanor entered the room silently and stopped upon seeing her son in that state. She had spent weeks unable to get close to him, and now that she had him in front of her, she couldn't hold back her tears. The man who had been her pride, her strong and determined son, now lay in bed like a shadow of what he once was. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his body had thinned so much that he seemed fragile, vulnerable. Seeing him like that broke her heart into 1,000 pieces, but it also ignited a strength in her she didn't know she had. She couldn't let Andrew die in that place. "Andrew, my son," she whispered as she approached the bed, gently stroking his hand. "I'm here. I'm here to get you out of this." Andrew slowly turned his head toward her, and although he couldn't utter a word, Eleanor saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. She knew deep down her son was still fighting, even if his body was weakened by months of poisoning. Emma approached delicately. "We have to move him now before Victoria returns," she whispered. "I've arranged for an ambulance to take us to a private clinic where he'll be safe." Eleanor nodded, quickly wiping away her tears. She knew this wasn't the time to break down. Together, Emma and Eleanor helped Andrew sit up as gently as possible. His body could barely support itself, and every small movement seemed to cause him pain. But there was no alternative. They needed to get him out before it was too late. Edward appeared at the door with a wheelchair, and with great care they placed Andrew in it. The silence in the mansion was absolute, but every small noise, from the wheels squeaking to the rustle of the sheets, seemed to echo loudly in the empty corridors. Any sound could alert someone, and they couldn't afford to be discovered. The journey through the mansion's corridors was tense, with every shadow and corner feeling like an imminent threat. As they advanced toward the back exit where the ambulance awaited them, Eleanor couldn't help but imagine what would happen if Victoria or Philip returned early. Her heart pounded, and the sense of urgency increased with every step. Finally, they reached the back door. The ambulance was there, just as Emma had promised, with a driver she'd hired, someone trustworthy who would ensure they reached the clinic without issues. Carefully, they placed Andrew on a stretcher and loaded him into the vehicle. Eleanor didn't allow herself to relax until the ambulance doors closed and they began to move away from the mansion. Emma was by her side, closely monitoring Andrew's condition as the vehicle sped toward the clinic. Although they knew the immediate danger had passed, the risk remained enormous. Victoria and Philip would soon discover Andrew wasn't in the house, and when they did, they would react with fury. As the ambulance drove away, Eleanor looked out the window, watching the mansion grow smaller in the distance. Part of her felt relief seeing the place that had caused her son so much harm disappear behind them. But another part, the more rational one, knew the real battle was about to begin. Getting Andrew out of the mansion was only the first step. The private clinic they arrived at was small, discreet, and away from the city's hustle and bustle. Emma had carefully chosen the place so Andrew could receive medical attention without Victoria or Philip interfering. As soon as they arrived, a medical team aware of the situation took charge of Andrew, immediately taking him to a room where they began treating him. Eleanor remained in the waiting room, sitting on an uncomfortable chair, while Emma and the doctors worked inside. She knew they were doing everything possible to save him, but the weight was unbearable. Every minute that passed without knowing how her son tore her apart inside. After what seemed like hours, Emma came out of the room with an expression of moderate relief. "Andrew is stable for now," she said in a reassuring tone. "His body has responded well to the initial treatment, but he's been subjected to a slow, prolonged poisoning process. It will take time for him to fully recover, if he does." Eleanor let out a sigh she'd been holding all day. "Will he survive?" she asked, her voice trembling with anguish. Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. "He has a good chance of surviving, but he'll need constant care. The damage caused by the poisoning is extensive, and his recovery will be a long and difficult process. What he needs most now is rest and stability." Eleanor nodded, relieved that at least her son was still alive. But she knew that relief was temporary. Out in the real world, the threat of Victoria and Philip remained, and it was only a matter of time before they started searching for Andrew. "The evidence of the poisoning," Eleanor began, interrupting her thoughts. "How much longer will it take to get the results?" "A few more days," Emma replied. "What we've found so far confirms our suspicions, but we need a more detailed analysis to present it as formal evidence." A few days. Eleanor felt those days would be eternal. There was no time to lose. Every second that passed was an opportunity for Victoria to act, and Eleanor knew they wouldn't sit idly by. In the mansion, Victoria and Philip arrived at Andrew's room. Victoria opened the door with her usual cold confidence, expecting to find her husband in the defenseless and vulnerable state she'd left him. But when she entered, her heart stopped. The bed was empty. For a second, she couldn't process what she was seeing. There was no medical staff, no equipment, no trace of Andrew. The room was completely empty. The silence that had pervaded the house now became deafening. Her cold gaze transformed into pure bewilderment. She slowly turned to Philip, whose eyes had widened upon realizing what Andrew's absence meant. "Where is he?" Victoria spat, her tone barely controlled. Philip began searching the room quickly, as if expecting to find some clue as to where Andrew had gone. But everything was meticulously in order, with no signs of struggle or any kind of problem. "This can't be happening," Victoria murmured, starting to lose the control she so carefully maintained. "How is it possible that he's gone? No one could have taken him out of here without me knowing." She approached Edward, who had followed at a prudent distance. "Edward, who was here while we were away?" Victoria asked, her tone icy. Edward, who had been anticipating this moment, kept his gaze low. Only the usual staff, ma'am. No one from outside the house. No one saw him leave. Victoria began to lose her composure. Her facade of control and power was quickly crumbling. How is it possible he disappeared without a trace? Edward paused slightly as if choosing his words carefully. It's possible someone from the staff helped him leave. He left the sentence hanging, knowing that pointing directly at someone would put more than one person, including himself, at risk. Victoria turned to Philip with an expression of pure hatred. I knew we should have taken more precautions. I knew we couldn't trust anyone, she said, almost spitting the words. But it doesn't matter. We'll find him, and when we do, there won't be anyone left to stand in our way. Back at the clinic, the atmosphere was tense. Eleanor, although relieved by her son's safety, couldn't stop thinking about the storm that was about to break. She knew Victoria and Philip wouldn't stop at anything to regain control of Andrew and his businesses. Emma, observing her concern, sat next to her. I know what you're thinking, she said softly. Victoria is going to come for him. We know that, but now we're closer to getting what we need to stop her. Eleanor nodded, but she couldn't calm her heart. Andrew has suffered so much, she murmured. I don't know how we got to this point. How did I not see who Victoria really was? Emma placed a hand over Eleanor's, trying to offer comfort. You did everything you could, she said, and now you've done the most important thing. You've gotten Andrew out of that place. Now it's time to fight to make sure he never falls into her hands again. Eleanor knew Emma was right. Victoria and Philip might be powerful, but now they also had weapons. The evidence of the poisoning, the documents proving the financial and legal manipulations. There were still many unanswered questions, but what was clear was that Andrew was no longer a passive victim. They would fight for him, and this time, Victoria and Philip would face justice. As night fell and the clinic's fresh air entered through the windows, Eleanor prepared herself mentally for what was to come. It wouldn't be easy, but a mother's love is an unstoppable force. Victoria might have carefully planned her conspiracy, but she underestimated the power of love, sacrifice, and determination. The battle for Andrew's life and legacy had only just begun. Eleanor felt that the battle for her son's life had just begun, and she was ready to face Victoria, no matter what it meant. The day began like the calm before a storm. Eleanor sat beside Andrew's bed in the clinic, watching him breathe softly. The regular sound of the heart monitor was the only constant reminder that life was still fighting within his weakened body. Next to her, Emma carefully checked Andrew's vital signs, ensuring everything was in order. The doctors had managed to stabilize him, but they knew recovery would be slow and that the damage caused by the poisoning had left deep scars. However, the mere fact that Andrew was safe and beginning to improve was a small victory, a ray of hope amid the darkness. But Eleanor knew that the peace she felt at that moment was only temporary. She knew that Victoria would not give up easily, and that, at any moment, her unleashed fury would fall upon them. The clock ticked slowly. Each second was a reminder that the final confrontation was approaching. Only one thing was missing to set their plan in motion: definitive proof confirming that Andrew had been poisoned. Suddenly, Emma entered the room hurriedly, an expression of urgency on her face. The test results have arrived, she announced, unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. The results confirm what we suspected. Andrew has been receiving increasing doses of poison in his treatment over the past months. Eleanor felt a mix of relief and horror. Relief because they now had the evidence needed to bring Victoria to justice, and horror because these proofs confirmed the extent of the evil perpetrated by the woman who had betrayed her son. Victoria had not only tried to destroy him physically and emotionally, but had done so with methodical cruelty, poisoning him slowly to take away everything he had built. And now what? Eleanor asked, trying to remain calm while her mind raced with possibilities. Emma, always pragmatic, responded quickly. With the medical evidence, along with the financial documents we already have, we can file a formal complaint, but we must act fast. Victoria won't take long to find the clinic or, worse, use her influence to try to stop us before we reach the authorities. Eleanor nodded, aware of the gravity of the moment. She knew they couldn't afford mistakes. With the evidence in hand, the next step would be to confront Victoria and Philip at their own game, but this time with the law on their side. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Victoria was beside herself. The employees, terrified by her temper, moved quickly to avoid crossing her path. The news of Andrew's disappearance had unhinged her, not only because her control over him had vanished, but because she feared what might happen if someone discovered what she had been doing. If Andrew managed to recover, if the evidence of the poisoning came to light, her entire life, fortune, and reputation would be in jeopardy. "This can't be happening," she murmured as she paced frantically in Philip's study. "We had everything under control, Philip. Everything." Philip, calmer but equally concerned, sat behind his desk, reviewing the contracts and financial moves they had manipulated over the months. "It's not as simple as him just disappearing," Philip said without looking up. "If Andrew is receiving medical treatment, it's only a matter of time before they discover the poisoning, and then we're finished." Victoria looked at him with fury, clearly frustrated by his calm demeanor. "Then we have to stop him," she shouted, her eyes blazing with rage. "We can't let it get to that point. Not now." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Philip asked, his tone cold. "We can't just walk into the clinic and take him out. It's too late for that." Victoria knew her brother was right, but that didn't lessen her desperation. She knew that Eleanor and Emma were behind all this, and the idea that her perfect plan was unraveling before her eyes filled her with anger. "There are other ways to control the situation," Philip finally said, looking up. "If we can get the authorities on our side before they present the evidence, we could discredit them. We need to make all this seem like a personal attack by Eleanor to regain control of Andrew's businesses." Victoria smiled, understanding her brother's plan. "Yes, we can make it appear as if this is a setup to discredit Eleanor, make her seem desperate. After all, who would trust a desperate mother trying to blame her daughter-in-law for an accident?" Both knew that, although it wasn't a long-term strategy, it could buy them enough time to prevent the evidence from reaching the authorities and somehow change the narrative later. At the clinic, Eleanor and Emma were preparing to take the evidence directly to the authorities. They knew they couldn't wait any longer. Emma had contacted a trusted lawyer familiar with the case, who would accompany them to present the medical evidence and financial documents. Everything was ready. Just as they were about to leave, Emma's phone rang. The lawyer's voice on the other end was tense. "There's a problem," he said. "Victoria and Philip have filed a complaint against you. They're claiming that Andrew was kidnapped by his mother and that this is all part of a plan to regain control of his fortune." Eleanor felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. "How is that possible?" she asked, her voice shaking with indignation. "Andrew is fighting for his life." "I know," the lawyer said, "but it seems they're pulling strings behind the scenes. They're trying to discredit you before you can present the evidence. You need to act now." Eleanor turned to Emma, knowing that the legal battle they were about to face would be even more difficult than they had imagined. But she also knew they couldn't stop. Andrew's well-being and life were at stake, and she couldn't allow Victoria to win this time. "Let's go," she said with renewed firmness. "We'll fight with everything we have." In court, the legal battle began intensely. Victoria, with her usual elegance, presented herself to the judge as a wife concerned for her husband's well-being, alleging that Eleanor and Emma had kidnapped him to take control of his fortune. However, when Eleanor presented the poisoning evidence, along with financial documents showing the manipulation of Andrew's businesses, the courtroom fell silent. Victoria tried to maintain her composure, but as the lawyers and witnesses presented evidence of her betrayal, her face began to crumble. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, quickly understood what had really happened. "Victoria and Philip," the judge declared, "are guilty of attempted murder and financial fraud." The sentence fell upon them like a mortal blow. Victoria, who had manipulated everything around her for years, watched as her empire crumbled in minutes. Security agents escorted her out of the courtroom, while Eleanor, relieved but exhausted, collapsed into a chair, feeling that justice had finally prevailed. The days following the trial were a mix of relief and reflection for Eleanor. With Victoria and Philip sentenced, life began to regain a calmer rhythm, although the healing process, for both Andrew and herself, would be long. The warm summer wind blew gently over the countryside where Eleanor had lived most of her life, and where she now found herself again, alongside her son, who was slowly recovering in the tranquility of their family home. Andrew had been moved from the clinic to a small rural house rented near Eleanor's home, where he received constant medical care, but was far from the painful memories of the mansion. Although his health was still fragile, he had shown clear signs of improvement in recent weeks. His strength was returning little by little, and although the road ahead was long, he was alive, out of danger, and surrounded by his mother's love. Eleanor sat on the porch of the small house, gazing at the horizon as the sun slowly descended. The sky was tinged with warm colors, and the sound of birds filled the air. So much had happened in recent months that, at times, she found it hard to believe it was all over. She remembered every moment of anguish, every tear shed beside her son's bed. And now, here she was, with Andrew safe and Victoria and Philip facing the consequences of their actions. Emma arrived shortly after, smiling with that mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that was so characteristic of her. She had decided to continue as Andrew's nurse during his recovery, and over time, she had become a close friend to Eleanor. They had shared a journey of struggle and sacrifice, and the bond they had forged was something that couldn't easily be broken. "He seemed a bit better today," Emma said as she sat next to Eleanor. "He's regaining mobility in his legs, and the doctors believe he'll soon be able to start walking again, although it will be a slow process." Eleanor smiled. Any small improvement was an immense gift to her. "Thank you, Emma. I don't know how I would have done all this without you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Emma returned the smile, but her eyes reflected something deeper. "It wasn't just for Andrew that I did it. You've been incredible, Eleanor. Your love and determination saved your son. It was you who never gave up, even when everything seemed lost." Eleanor looked toward the horizon, letting Emma's words sink in. She didn't consider herself a hero, far from it, but she knew she had fought with everything she had. In the end, it was a mother's love that had driven her, that had given her the strength to face Victoria despite all the difficulties. Later, Eleanor entered the house and went directly to Andrew's room. He was sitting on the bed, propped up by pillows, his eyes closed. But upon sensing his mother's presence, he opened his eyes slowly and smiled. "Mom," he murmured in a soft but clear voice. Eleanor approached and sat next to him, taking his hand in hers. The warmth of his touch comforted her, a constant reminder that her son was still with her. "You're getting better every day, my son," she said tenderly. "Soon you'll be running through the fields again, just like when you were a child." Andrew let out a small laugh, though it was evident it took effort. "Maybe I won't run as fast as before, but I hope to be on my feet soon." They remained silent for a moment, enjoying each other's company. The time for words was no longer as necessary as before. Just being together after everything they'd been through was enough. "I want you to know something, Mom," Andrew said suddenly, his voice more firm. "During all this time, even though I couldn't speak or move, I felt you. I knew you were close, even when I was at the mansion. I knew you hadn't abandoned me. That's what gave me the strength to keep fighting, even when everything seemed lost." Eleanor felt tears welling up in her eyes. She squeezed her son's hand more firmly, trying to contain the emotions overwhelming her. "I will always be with you, Andrew," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Always." As days passed, life began to find a new balance. Andrew gradually regained more mobility, thanks to physical therapy sessions and the constant support of Emma and the doctors. The process wasn't easy, but every small step represented a victory, not just for him, but also for Eleanor, who watched as her son became the strong and determined man she had always known. Meanwhile, Victoria and Philip were sentenced to prison for their crimes. The trial had been a catharsis for Eleanor, who, although filled with pain for what her son had suffered, could see how justice finally prevailed. The empire Victoria had tried to build based on lies and betrayal crumbled, and although the damage done to Andrew couldn't be completely erased, at least now he was out of danger. With time, Eleanor decided to return to live in her home in the countryside, the place that had always been her refuge, while Andrew remained nearby in the small rural house where he continued his recovery. The bond between mother and son had strengthened through everything they'd endured, and both knew that, although the journey had been difficult, the most important thing was that they had traveled it together. Months later, on a peaceful afternoon, Eleanor and Andrew decided to walk through the nearby fields. Andrew, although he still needed support to walk long distances, felt stronger each day. The blue and clear sky stretched above them as they walked slowly, recalling the times when Andrew was just a boy running freely through those same fields. "This place gives me peace," Andrew said as he observed the landscape. "It's as if everything we've been through stays behind every time I'm here." Eleanor smiled, feeling the same relief. "Here is where you'll always find your home, my son. No matter how far you go, this will always be your refuge." Andrew looked at her and smiled. He knew that, no matter what happened in the future, he would always have his mother by his side. That was his true wealth, something neither Victoria nor Philip could ever take from him. The sun began to set on the horizon, and mother and son continued walking together, with the promise of a future filled with peace after having faced and overcome the darkness. Life had changed, but the love and strength they shared would unite them forever. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of courage, love, and justice. If Eleanor and Andrew's story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming episodes filled with drama and unexpected twists. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your favorite moments or insights in the comments below. Until next time, remember that love and perseverance can overcome even the darkest of challenges.